Did I ever tell you about my Uncle Sam? I know what you're thinking. This is going to be another old Army war story. But no, I actually had a real-life Uncle Sam. But at least that's what we called him because we weren't actually related. But still, if you were to compare his story growing up with the story of my father growing up, both born about the same time back in the 1920s in the South, both born in the South, both graduating high school before the age of 16, both going into the ministry, it's not hard to see why they got along so well. And if you're an older African American, or if you had attended an HBCU, you're probably familiar with my Uncle Sam by personal relationship, or you may have just seen his name on some building that folks decided to name after a preacher. The senior pastor at Abyssinia Baptist Church in Harlem, an educator as the former president of North Carolina A&T and HBCU, as well as a professor for many years at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and a statesman who had served in the early days of the Peace Corps in the Kennedy administration and as a director in the Johnson administration, who grew up in the Tidewater in Norfolk, Virginia, Reverend Samuel Dewitt Proctor. I still remember the day in Harlem attending the Abyssinia Baptist Church when Uncle Sam, Reverend Calvin Butts, and my father had tried their best to ambush me and convince me that I had wanted to be a preacher like my father. Because back in the old days, if your daddy was a preacher, just like my daddy followed in his daddy's footsteps, at least one of the boys in the family had to follow in his father's footsteps and accept the call to be a minister. That was just the way that it was, and it served a useful purpose because there was a guaranteed line of succession in the profession of the ministry. And Uncle Sam had a story about some of the old black family traditions that he used to tell about why he had always felt good about being an American and about the American dream. And I also remember many of his illustrations and jokes about who's going to bring the wagon back. Like my father's surviving parents lived with him when I was very, very young. Our grandmother was in our house. Uncle Sam's grandparents lived with his parents to pass on the history of the family, like the old griots that you might have seen in Alex Haley's roots. And as a matter of fact, they provided wisdom and moral instruction, like making sure that all the children went to church on Sunday. Like my father's grandparents, Uncle Sam's grandparents were formerly slaves. And Uncle Sam's grandmother was a slave on a plantation, but she was on a good plantation where they decided to give her an education even when she was a slave. And they even helped her to go on after emancipation to attend Hampton University, an HBCU. And she always emphasized the importance of having an education because at least in those days, when we were colored, or Negro as the president says, when African Americans were poor but didn't know it because it wasn't a priority to dwell on the thoughts about the disadvantages of being poor, it was pretty obvious that everyone who tended to be doing really well and had an education, and everyone who was living just above the scratch line, as Uncle Sam used to say, didn't continue on with their education. Got cooked in the SWAT. Started out on the rise, but got cooked in the SWAT. But one of Uncle Sam's many stories was the story of his wife's father, who was a pharmacist, who became a pharmacist by attending Shaw University, another HBCU in North Carolina. And when he graduated, because of segregation, he could only fill prescriptions for other black people in his community in Fredericksburg, Virginia. But his son attended the Philadelphia College of Pharmacology and Science, continuing in the family business. And he went on to become the chief pharmacist at the Walter Reed Army Hospital and was responsible for filling the prescriptions for President Eisenhower, for whom Uncle Sam served as an advisor during the earliest days of the Civil Rights Movement. And his Uncle Sam's son became the president of a company you would probably know, especially in pandemic, Johnson & Johnson, which was actually founded by three brothers, family, who joined together to make sterile surgical dressings back in 1866. They were three white guys, but they were acquired by the John Hill Company the next year, which was black-owned, amazingly, in 1877. And that part of their portfolio was listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 1954, the year after the Korean War ended and the year of the landmark decision of Brown v. Board of Education, and was ranked 36 in the Fortune 500 in 2021. But they got acquired by Procter & Gamble in 2004. And today, I don't think that Mr. Gorski is a black Russian. And I certainly know from growing up and listening to stories from people like Uncle Sam that you can learn a lot about how, even in what is often today considered to be bad times, there were strong black communities with strong families and black-owned businesses. And back in the days where most black folks went to church on Sundays because that was the way that it was, and perhaps there wasn't very much of an alternative, but it worked. Yet, by the time of the presidency of the first African-American president, the percentage of two-parent black families had declined by almost 50%. And during his presidency, membership and attendance in historically African-American churches experienced their sharpest decline. And racial tensions reached their highest since the days of the Civil Rights Movement. But in 2016, President Barack Obama told Howard University graduates in D.C. at their commencement, if you had to choose a time to be, in the words of Lorraine Hansberry, young, gifted, and black in America, you would choose right now. You would choose right now if you were young, if you were gifted, and if you were also black. But while African-American women far outpace any demographic in education these days, as measured by percentage of persons enrolling in college, only 50% of African-American males are college-bound. Only 71% of African-American overall graduate from high school, and only 23% hold bachelor's degrees, compared to 36% for Caucasians, cooked in the squat. And only 13% of African-American males even hold a college degree, far outpaced by black women. And just like the median income for a black family is 8 times less than that of a white family, on average, a white student will have gone to a more competitive college than a black student. And that has something to do with a better income, a lot of times. Not necessarily because of what you learn, but because of the people that you meet. Always travel first class. And perhaps you can just say that it is what it is. Or you can say, if it is to be, it is up to me. But unlike Sam, many don't say what he said. He was an optimist. He didn't care if he was the last optimist in the world. And you see where optimism took him. Because just like in baseball or golf, when you take a swing in life, the ball is generally going to go in the direction that you're aiming. But today, when everyone is discussing voting rights and critical race theory and Supreme Court justices, a recent survey took a pulse on black America, and they found that only 1 in 4 black men and 1 in 3 black women agreed that it was a good time to be in America, compared to just a decade and a half ago, before the Obama administration, where 60% of black men agreed with that statement, that it was a good time to be in America. Or even just 10 years ago, at the beginning of Barack Obama's second term, when 73% of black women thought it was a good time to be American in black. When the Smithsonian Institution, after acquiring over 300,000 original African-American history artifacts, opened in 2016, around the time of the election, one of the exhibits had identified the 4 pillars of African American success in America. And I think it holds true for just about any race. And when you think about my Uncle Sam and his success, it appears to be a valid assessment. Number 1, black families, like the Johnson brothers that started Johnson & Johnson. Black families, which just 50 years ago found even JJ, Thelma, and Michael Evans in the Cabrini Greens project in Chicago had a mama and a papa. But today, find just about 23% of black families that even look like the Evans family on Good Times. And if you asked Uncle Sam where he received his sense of somebodyness, he'd tell you in a second. It was from his family, learning from the stories from his grandparents about slavery and from his parents. And even though his daddy had one of the better jobs available back in the days of Jim Crow and lynching, working in the naval yard, his family didn't know that they were poor. They were definitely better off than those who had parents who were handymen and domestics, but they still didn't think that they were poor. And they made do with what they had. And whenever he went out, trying to act a fool like young people do, his grandmother, who had gone off to college, would always tell Uncle Sam to remember that he was a prophet. And you need that kind of self-assurance if you want to succeed. Number 2, because of segregation, the only businesses that would serve black people were black-owned businesses. And so there were black barbers and hairstyling salons. Black people got to get their hair done. Black newspapers, black school teachers, like my grandmother in a segregated schoolhouse in North Carolina. Black pharmacists like Uncle Sam's father-in-law. Black attorneys, like my childhood mentor, Ray Brown. And black doctors, like Dr. Duff, who played an instrumental role when my dad was coming up in Philadelphia. And by August 2020, in the first year of the public health crisis, over 50% of black businesses that had been around for years were gone. Even Georgia Brown's restaurant in D.C., which was said to be one of Michelle Obama's favorite restaurants in D.C., was closed in pandemic for good. And just reviewing one of Uncle Sam's favorite stories, you begin to see where that sense of community that sustained black businesses began to erode away with advancing years and times, because his father-in-law was a pharmacist who could only serve black customers. But his son went off to Walter Reed. And even Uncle Sam's son went off to work at a large pharmaceutical company, making the way for Duane Reade, CVS's and Rite Aid's to become the local pharmacy. And no longer will you have having blacks come back to the community. And it's always a better bet to bet on the sure thing. It certainly was a formula that worked for my Uncle Sam. And you look like an intelligent person. This briefing is unclassified. Until next time, you have a right to remain silent as you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for U.S. Congress. Next year, make the right choice, and we shall make America great again. Amen. And y'all come back now. Here. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.